I completely understand. Yeah, but it's been really active this year so far.
Yeah, I think he missed working the first half. He was very excited to connect with all of you again. Okay.
We're on the shows.
We're live.
Yes, we should be.
All right, we're live. Okay. Live. Hello, everybody. I am Mary Vermillion, an English professor here at Mount Mercy and director of the Visiting Writer Series. And I want to welcome all of you in Flaherty, and also all of you in the live stream who are here to savor the work of our visiting writer, Carol Tyx. Before I get to her intro, just a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to thank Cultural Affairs for funding Carol's visit. I'd like to thank Marketing and the Communication Office, Jamie Jones and her team, for handling the technology for tonight's event. Carol's reading will remain on Mount Mercy's YouTube channel, so you can tell your friends about it. After Carol's done discussing her book and taking questions from all of you and from you all on YouTube, you can purchase copies of her book, and she can sign your book. We'll figure out a socially distant way to make that happen. In the spring, the English program and the Visiting Writer Series is teaming up with Keisha Burke-Henderson and the Diversity Office to host performance poet Yanni Davis, and details of her visit will be available soon. But tonight, I'm happy and honored to welcome my friend Carol Tyx back to Mount Mercy, and I'm grateful that we're able to hear her discuss her newest collection of poetry, Remaking Achilles, Slicing into Angola's History. Carol retired from Mount Mercy in spring of 2019 after teaching in our English program for nearly 20 years. She is the author of several essays and 3 books of poetry. Some of her poems have been nominated for the prestigious Pushcart Prize, and she is currently artist in residence at Prairie Woods Franciscan Spirituality Center. During her time at Mount Mercy, Carol was a beloved teacher and colleague. She was generous with her time and expertise, and she was committed to making sure that everyone's voice was heard and valued. In 2008, Carol started an ongoing service learning project in which Mount Mercy students lead book club discussions with inmates at the Louisiana State Penitentiary just up the road. This project helped inspire poetry in the collection Carol will share with us tonight. And if you look inside Remaking Achilles, the dedication, you'll see that it's for the readers in the Louisiana State Penitentiary Book Club. And last spring, when Carol launched her book on Zoom, the members of the Anamosa Book Club were thrilled to be able to join her virtually and share their thoughts on her book. Remaking about a 1951 protest at the largest prison in the United States, the Angola State Penitentiary. Their attendance in response to the prison's brutal conditions. Although it's a painful book, Remaking Achilles is a perfect book for our times because it shows that we can remake our world. It shows that even under the most oppressive conditions, people can create positive change. Please help me welcome a positive change maker, Carol Tyx.
be here. This is the first live reading I've done from this book. I've done several Zoom events. And I'm going to start with a poem, and then I'll backtrack a little and tell a little bit how I came to write this collection. So I went to Angola to do some research at the museum there and their archives. And I have a tour of the prison, since it would be the setting of many of these poems. So this opening poem is the opening poem of the book, and it talks about driving to Angola. It's called Long and Winding Road. Once, you could only get there by boat. Now there's a narrow road through the tangle of the Tunica Hills. No shoulder, dead ending at the gate. From the turnoff onto Louisiana 66, a sprinkle of trailers, a post office, an elementary school, 3 churches, 2 Baptist, 1 Methodist, a sign that reads, Jesus Christ is Lord of Tunica, then nothing but trees and a descending, as if you were winding through Dante's circles until you hit bottom. The farm, the big house, Alcatraz of the South, Siberia of Dixie, Angola. I remember the first time I drove there, and it really is, the road just winds and winds and gets narrower and lower, and it's kind of eerie. So as Mary said, this project, which is unlike anything I've written before, grew out of the prison book club that Mary and I facilitate. And we were writing a paper about our project, and to do some background research, we read some prison narratives. And one of them that I read was by Wilbert Riddell, who spent 40 years in Angola. And he had one sentence in the brief history he gave, which talked about 31 men slitting their Achilles tendons as a protest. And I thought, whoa, that's something, to mutilate your body in an attempt to make change. So I started to investigate that incident, mostly through newspaper accounts from the time and magazine articles. And I thought I might write a handful of poems about this incident. But it just turned out to be so fascinating that I just kept finding out more things and writing more poems. So it turned into a whole book. So the next photo shows I hope.
Is there something I need to do besides?
There's a resume thing.
You can click on F5. Okay, 1 second.
It's a different licensed product. It's like
Oh, technology.
it won't show the other slides because it's an unlicensed product.
It works every week, you know.
It's something to do.
There we go. We want that next one.
So just.
There we go. So this is an old photo from the Library of Congress, which shows men picking cotton at Angola. So the state of Louisiana did not want to pay to house and feed prisoners. So in the early part of the 20th century, they leased their prisoners out as laborers. So in a sense, they were kind of like slaves, having to work for somebody else. And the state of Louisiana saw that this system of contract labor was making money for the person who was renting these prisoners. So they decided, we should get in on this. We could make money off of the prison and the prisoners. So they bought the same plantation where they had been leased, and the name of that plantation was Angola. So this next poem is called How to Make a Plantation Prison. And Angola is 18,000, the prison is 18,000 acres. It's huge. It's a working farm. When I went there, the only prisons I had been to were Anamosa and Oakdale here in Iowa. And I thought I would just walk around. So this is how to make a plantation prison. Buy a plantation, preferably a big one in a remote location. House convicts in the slave quarters. When the quarters collapse, build the convict camp on the same site. Make sure most prisoners are black. Make sure all prisoners know they are expendable. When more than 100 prisoners die in a year, increase arrests. Raise cotton. Pick it by hand, or substitute sugar for cotton. Cut that by hand too. Keep profits high by slashing wages to almost nothing, or better yet, eliminate them. Make 12-hour days the norm. Use flogging to combat exhaustion. Spend as little as possible on medical care, nothing on education. Hire prisoners as overseers. Give them guns and no pay. When there's a shooting, don't ask questions. So, even today, when men first arrive at Angola, everybody works in the field. There are other jobs now, but you start by working in the field. And they often have to walk a long distance to get to the place they need to be in that field. So the men get in what they call the long line, as you see here, walking out to the field. So the next poem describes that long line. step. as and never had a chance I took a picture of the big green I looked at the people and said, and this the realization but at least we're not black man throw bread and spoons minding our own business. None of us need to do that. When that committee came together, we heard ourselves busting with meetings by host stops that bring back. We and Charles and Henry brought their heads and showed us black shoes. Like, we're the ones who spoke of faith. It's bad here that it might be worse. At least every year that those marks carry their grade. We all know that won't be the same. Expect us to listen. They're never taught us the running but a meat cleaver. And the word out. We know we're going to play a step away from us. But right now, we've done it ourselves. True. Backs and photo of what they used to call the dungeons being destroyed after the it went all the way to the governor's race. The commission that followed the decision of the governor's in 1951. And eventually these dungeons, which were kind of underground cells with no windows, totally black, small, with a tiny air pipe at the top. So this is from the point of view of an African American called Cold Truth. And the judges are also called Cold. I just spent 4 days in the hole last summer. Couldn't tell day from night. No windows, like you dead, buried in a box. Ain't no accident the hole is in Camp A. Black men buried in blackness. A concrete box for a toilet. Only bread and water pushed through a slot once a day if you're lucky. The smell of your piss and shit roasting in that oven. And on top, that 2-inch pipe, a blade of air so you don't suffocate. Only the time they threw 8 of us in, only 7 crawled out. Glad that dungeon's gone. I want to believe it's done. But I see my daddy in that sweat box called sharecropping, and I know it ain't over yet. And this next poem is written from the point of view of Maggie Dixon, who's another character in the book. She was the editor of the Baton Rouge Morning Advocate, one of the first women to be a managing editor. And she had always had an interest in the inmates. She grew up in the levee camps. Her father was an engineer, and they used convict labor. So she'd been around inmates all her life, and continued that interest when she was a newspaper woman and editor. So here, and she was also the co-chair of the investigation committee. So here's a poem from her point of view. Dungeons at Angola destroyed by Governor Kennan as prisoners watch. That's the headline I wrote September 24th, 1952, for the Morning Advocate. Over a year had passed since we finished our investigation of the field stringers, and finally something was happening. One of our recommendations put into action right there in front of us. The new governor, Robert Kennan, and the new warden, Sam Anderson, drove that bulldozer straight at that hellhole, and in 2 pushes it was over. It was a staged event. Reporters scribbling, photographers snapping, legislators nodding. But the real event happened behind us, outside the Camp A dorm, where the prisoners watched, their bodies black against the whitewashed wall. They hooped and hollered as if it were a boxing match. Get him, take him down. As if all those years someone had them by the throat. And now they were back on their feet, swaying and clapping, and no one was ever going to bury them alive again. All right. And I'll close with, it's the final poem in the book. This is the cemetery at Angola called Point Lookout. And they have this fancy hearse that takes inmates who have died up to the cemetery. This final poem is again in the voice of that character of Achilles. Point Lookout, becoming Achilles. Some inmates want to be buried here. Want that ride up to Lookout in that fancy hearse? Look like a stagecoach pulled by horses. And some make it known they want out, even if it's wrapped in cardboard. Though nowadays, after a body fell right out of a wet box, they got this wood shop turns out a first-class coffin. Me, after my heel got infected, wasn't even allowed into Lookout. No white cross and a white picket fence. I got shipped to New Orleans in a body bag, smelling like shit, bad as that castor oil bag. Those researchers went at me with their razor-sharp knives that I envied. It would have hurt a whole lot less with a blade like that. When they got to my heel, oozing with poison, they named me Achilles. Best name I've ever been called. Thank you. Questions?
So I know this book is in sequence according to the events that happened, but was there a poem that came to you first? That maybe wasn't in the right.
You know, I didn't write them in sequence at all. I kind of wrote them as I discovered research that was interesting to me. So, for instance, when I took that trip to Angola, I also went to Louisiana State University, and in their archives were the papers of Maggie Dixon, that editor. And so I learned a lot about her life there. I wrote those poems all at once. So I really didn't write. It was interesting to try to put the sequence together after I had written the poems, because I just kind of wrote here and there.
Was there one that jumped out to you first when you first started writing?
You know, I wrote the one Remaking Achilles, just sort of about the whole event, and I thought maybe that would be the only one I would write, that first one. And then I also discovered there's some poems, I didn't read many of them, that talk about the conditions at Angola in the 30s and 40s before this incident happened. And I discovered there was a radio show by a former prisoner. His name was Wooden Ear, because he had lost some of his hearing. And he talked a lot about specific conditions at Angola. So I got a lot of ideas for poems from, there was a transcript made of those shows and it's recently been discovered. So I got a lot of real specific information from that radio series. It was really helpful. Yes?
Do prisoners still work in the fields today?
Yes, they do. That's the first job every prisoner in Angola has. There's a video called The Farm. That's another name for Angola. And it's contemporary. And it shows men going out into the fields in the long line. Yep. They raise all their own food. They used to have a cannery there where they sold food to grocery stores. Since somewhere along the line that got stopped because they were undercutting the prices of everybody else. But they provide food for all the prison system in Louisiana. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned you're doing a book club for prisoners at the Angola State Penitentiary. What did writing this book teach you? Did it teach you anything different about prison life or prisoners in general? Did you get a new perspective?
Oh, that's a great question. I think even though the brutality of the conditions at Angola, especially in the 40s and 50s, is not what it's like today, but still the sense of you are at the mercy of the guards. That, things are out of your control. And that kind of entered me in a deeper way, that understanding of how powerless you can feel as a prisoner.
When you first got the idea for this book, how did you come up with the idea to write from all these different perspectives?
You know, I had taught a book called The Unghosting of Medgar by Frank X. Walker from Kentucky. He actually was a leading writer here a number of years ago. And his book tells the story of the assassination of Medgar Evers, who was the secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. And he does that. He gives the point of view of Medgar Evers' wife, he gives the point of view of the assassin, and various other characters. And that really influenced me. In talking with Frank after his reading, I was just thinking like, wow, that would just really be interesting to write a book having nothing to do with yourself, which often my poetry is about my own experience. But to write a book based on research and try to give these multiple perspectives. So it was really that book by Frank X. Walker that kind of opened my eyes to possibilities.
Carol, we have a question on YouTube from Madeline Orton, 2020 graduate. She says, "Hi Carol, so great to see you. Can you briefly talk about your editing process and your thought process while editing your work?"
Oh, hi Madeline. Editing, yes, there's a lot of editing. I tend to write long the first time, like I want to get all the details in. Any interesting detail I find, I want to get it into the poem. And sometimes it's just too much, and the poem doesn't need all of that. So I have to wait a few weeks and come back and read it with a fresh eye to see what I can chip away. So some of these poems were almost twice as long when they started. And so most of my editing is repeated. Did you have a question, Joe?
Yeah, I was just curious about something. Some of the poems that you read are in the voice, well, most of them are in the voice of some other person. I imagine taking on the voice of an Irish immigrant nurse wasn't necessarily that challenging, but I would think it would be pretty tricky to try and be accurate when you're writing as an African American in the 1950s, and sort of the kind of expression they would use to both try and recreate an authentic voice, but to do it respectfully. And I just wondered how you approach that balance, how you try to use the language without in any way seeming to mock the language of another culture that you're writing in.
That was a real challenge. That was a big challenge. And a couple things were significant. One is I read the writer Ernest Gaines, who's a novelist from Louisiana, from the same region. And I read several of his novels and studied how he had it, and he's African American, and studied how he had his characters talk. And that was really important to me. And I also, this is part of my editing process, Maggie, I went back through and I took out some of the dialect. I didn't want it to be too heavy, like I was trying too hard to make it sound like, whether it's black or white, these are Southerners, and I'm not a Southerner either. To try to get the flavor of it, but not overdo it. It was tricky. There were numerous places where I went back and forth. What should I use here? So that was definitely a challenge, to try to get the language to fit the character without making it a caricature. It's a delicate balance.
Carol, we have another question here on YouTube from Mackenzie Jensen. And she says, "Hi Carol, your favorite former student here. What made you choose this particular subject to write about?" And then she clarifies, "I mean, I understand why it's moving, but why this particular thing?"
That's a really good question, Mackenzie. And I'm not sure I can fully answer it. Why this incident? I mean, there's tons of incidents of prison brutality. And why this particular one pulled at me? There was something about the willingness to harm your own body as a way of expressing yourself. It was just struck me so powerfully. And the more I read about the incident, just the more complicated it got. I didn't even get into the part where the nurse is accused of, the nurse wants to show how corrupt things are in Angola. And she knows there's drugs everywhere in the prison. And the guards are, some of the guards are even part of the drug rings. And so she uses a marked $5 bill and buys some heroin to show as evidence how easy it is to get heroin. And the sheriff, who didn't like this whole investigation at all going on, tried to arrest her for heroin possession. And there was just this real, I mean, just things like that. I just kept finding out these weird things that happen. So that's the best answer I can give, Mackenzie. I'm glad you're listening.
Did writing this energize or exhaust you?
You know, it was actually really energizing. You know, it's weird because it's a very heavy subject, and a lot of it is, it's just brutal, it's dehumanizing. But I just found working on it so fascinating that and it also helped me to know that through the investigation, conditions really did change, at least for a while. The history of prison reform in Angola has a kind of up and down, and it got bad again later. But the process of selecting a warden had been, this was awarded to somebody who was a crony to be the warden at Angola. There was no professional person in charge. And this really changed. They hired for the very first time someone who was really trained, and conditions did change. So that made me feel like, kind of like resistance is possible, even for people who have very limited power.
Out of your collection, do you have a favorite?
No, I think I really like that last poem, the one about the cemetery. That was the idea of using Achilles as a character. That was, sometimes you just get these inspirations and they're just kind of gifts. You don't really know where they come from. And I just felt like working with that particular poem was a gift. Just a little aside, there's a very short poem in the book that talks about the person that named the Achilles tendon. He was a Dutch anatomist. And when I found this detail out, I just said, oh my gosh, here's a poem. He discovered the Achilles tendon by dissecting his own leg. He'd had gangrene and the leg had been amputated, but he was dissecting his own leg when he discovered the Achilles tendon. So that sort of lineage of cutting into your own foot was like, oh my gosh, that's just amazing.
I don't remember his name, but there was a Civil War general who was injured in battle and his leg was cut off, and he put it in the museum for the rest of his life. He'd go there every once in a while to visit his own leg.
Yeah. Mhm.
Have you heard any, or do you know of any reaction to the collection from anybody associated with the prison, and anybody down there in Louisiana that's read it, that is contact you, or is it reviewed in Louisiana?
You know, I tried to get the Louisiana State Press to publish it, but they didn't want it. The woman who is the chief historian in Angola, her name, she's on the back of the book, Marianne, I'm trying to get it right here, Fisher G. Orlando. She was so helpful to me, and she loaned me some copies of articles and made suggestions about where to look. And she's been trying to work on getting me to come down there. They have a symposium every few years and on prison writing and do a presentation. So, and I know she gave the book to an inmate who's a poet as well.
Were there any parts of writing from all different perspectives that you felt that you could surprisingly relate to?
Could you say that one more time?
From the different perspectives that all the poems were from, did you surprisingly relate to any of them, and was it easy to write in a way?
Huh. I think in some ways, Maggie Dixon, who was the newspaper editor, you know, she was an ally from the outside, which is kind of the position that I would be in. And I think in some ways I really connected with her story of trying to help be useful for prison reform, but she's not in the system. Anything else from you, Jack?
Joy Oaks said, great presentation, Carol.
Glad you're listening, Joy.
This question I have is more about perspective from an author. So you have a lot of emotions invested in this story, and from your perspective, do you think someone could be a good author without having those invested emotions in the story?
I think you have to have some empathy with your characters in order to make a real connection with them. Even if there's somebody who's kind of despicable in many ways, to find things about them that are human and connect with them. Yeah.
I thought you did a pretty good job when you were writing the voice of that sheriff without making him clownish or buffoonish. You know, that you know, there was some honest emotion there. You know, this spoiled my Easter, my deputy's Easter. He was kind of worried about his you know, there is a touch of humanity for the wrong people that we have to, you know.
Yeah, because it's Easter and I gotta go take care of this. And I just love the detail about the meat cleavers. That was the weapon they had.
I like your description in the first poem when you described Angola as the Siberia of the sea. First you gave this picture of a really narrow, long, winding road, and then suddenly there it is. And I just got a really good visual just from that description there. I really like that Siberia of the sea.
Thank you. Yeah, those are all names. Those weren't original with me. Those are names that Angola has been called.
Oh, they were, okay.
Yeah. But it is startling when you're on a highway and then it just dead ends at the prison. And it's way out of nowhere. It abuts the Mississippi when I talked about how it used to be there wasn't even a road, that you got there only by boat. It's really in a remote location. Yes?
Who was like the hardest character to write?
You know, I think it was the warden. I didn't read any of the warden's poems. And I think it's kind of for that same reason, Joe, you were talking about. It was hard not to make the warden a caricature of just this good old boy. And I had a hard time having empathy for him. You know, he was convinced that the prison was being run in a manner that was totally acceptable to him. And, you know, the floggings and the dungeon and all of that, that was just business as usual for him. And so he was, and there wasn't a whole lot of research about him to help me see his more human side. So he was a hard character for me. Good question. Yes?
Was there ever a moment in your research where you just had to stop the research part of it because of how inhumane parts of it was?
I won't say that it stopped me, but I might, that incident with the castor oil, that's from research. The prisoner was tied to a post and given castor oil so that they would shit themselves. It just almost seemed unreal to me, the level of cruelty. And reading things like that, it's hard to stomach.
Carol, we have another question here from Mackenzie. How do you decide how much of a person's character to reveal in your writing? How do you avoid revealing parts of their story that isn't yours to tell?
You know, that's a question that pervades this whole book in many ways. And that's an interesting question literarily, just, you know, who has the right to tell a story? And in some ways, the story is not mine. You know, I'm that Maggie Dixon figure. I'm an outside character. I'm not on the inside. And I guess in some ways, I gave myself permission to write it because nobody else was going to tell these stories if I didn't. I mean, this is an incident that happened in 1951. Everybody who's involved in it is dead. And I mean, we're still dealing with issues in how people are treated in prison and how we think about prisons. So I guess I felt it was worth it to take on a story that wasn't mine because it seemed important. It was a gripping story, and it might help us think about prisons even in our contemporary world. There weren't a whole lot of personal details. And I had to scrounge. So I wasn't worried about revealing too much of an individual person. Like Wallace McDonald, he has interviews where there's nothing new in these poems. He's said those things already. So I felt like using those details that were already public. I couldn't interview anybody. They were all kept on.
Mackenzie says, P.S. I'm sitting in my living room nodding at you like she can see.
It's very fun to see former students, even if I can't see them.
So you said that the nurse started to type, and she typed all night long, right? Wrote her story. Can you actually read what she...
Yes, you can. Yes. In fact, one of the poems that I didn't read is what I call a found poem. It's totally, every word in that poem is from her testimony. But yes, there are copies of her testimony in articles that I found. Yeah. And I think, they called as witnesses in that investigation. The governor and the warden, who were in cahoots with each other, tried to control who they chose to come and speak. And, but the nurse decided not to be controlled. She was going to speak her truth. And she had to leave her job. She lost her job. And her husband worked there too. So she sacrificed her job to tell the truth. And it made, in the articles I read about the investigation, it stunned the committee to hear. I mean, here was a medical professional talking about the injuries she had seen caused by people who worked at the prison. All right, shall we call it a night? Thank you all for coming. It was lovely to have a live audience, and it was good to have everybody else in the virtual world. So, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Carol.